I'm very happy to be chatting with Ben Carey, who is my colleague at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. Ben is in Sydney on Gadigal land, part of the Eora Nation, and I'm in Berlin, Germany. I know Ben as a wonderful composer, performer, and improviser, primarily working with modular synthesizers and with interactive systems that often draw in audiovisual elements as part of the compositional process. So Ben, a lot of your work has been about human-machine interactions, but this work for the JACK Quartet is both, I believe, your first string quartet and your first completely acoustic work. Though, of course, instruments are kinds of technologies as well. But was that a big shift for you to write this work?
An incredibly big shift. Yeah, it was. I mean, I think the opportunity given to me by this piece and these performers, these incredible performers, made that shift quite an easy decision to make, I think. I mean, this particular piece, at first I had ideas about doing a work that had some form of human-machine interactivity, designing software that the ensemble members played with, and having some kind of back and forth in that way. But there was just something about the medium and something about some of the original kind of seed ideas that were being scored that quite quickly put that idea to bed and made me kind of pivot in a different direction. So yeah, it's absolutely new. And it's also one of the first pieces that I've written that doesn't involve any, say, improvised elements as well. So although of course there's interpretive freedom in the work, everything's strictly scored. So that kind of surprised me coming out of the process.
Yeah. So the title of the work, this beautiful title, is "And Contribute to Each Other's Support." And you take symbiosis as a key principle or guiding metaphor, let's say, for the composition. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So symbiosis, the title "And Contribute to Each Other's Support" comes from the dictionary definition of symbiosis. In that, symbiosis for me has been a metaphor in a lot of the work that I've been doing over the past maybe 5 to 10 years. And mainly in this area of interactions between humans and machines. I like the idea of symbiosis as a metaphor for interdependence. So a lot of the time when we're writing software that human performers interact with, we're thinking about developing software that might have some form of autonomy. It has a form of life in and of itself. And I've always thought that word autonomy is probably not as important to me as the word interdependence, this idea that humans and machines can be interdependent on each other. And so that's kind of where it started, because I had this idea of using the computer, but the title stuck, and the idea of symbiosis, I think, morphed into a different form in this work. Interdependence as being something that is about the way that the material itself developed. It was about the process of how I engaged with these musical ideas, with the materials that were coming out of the compositional process, and how everything was kind of interdependent on each other. The idea to write a work that was completely acoustic, the medium of the string quartet and all of the weight of history of that particular ensemble. And the performers themselves as well. So it became a broader metaphor than an interactive metaphor, but it still, I think, it had resonance whilst I was writing the work.
And so when you encountered the specific musicians, so not just the string quartet as this sort of gigantic historical construct, but, the specificity of, Chris Otto and Austin Williman on violins and John Richards on viola and Jay Campbell on cello. How did that shift things for you, or did it shift things for you?
It did greatly. I mean, I've been a big fan of the JACK Quartet for a long time. I saw them perform, I think back in, might have been 2013. They came out to perform some works, including a premiere by Jack Simons here in Sydney. And so I've known of their work for a while, and knowing that I had this commission, I've done a lot of listening to the latest stuff that they've been putting out, particularly during the pandemic. They've been putting out a lot of videos and performances, and I just absolutely adore their dynamism as a group. There's like an electricity of this particular ensemble, and so writing the work was I always had in my mind those particular performers, and the way that the lines that jump from one instrument to another, who they were actually jumping between, even down to at times some of the kind of splitting of the ensemble, thinking about where each ensemble member was sitting and which musical line was being passed to whom. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you're writing for anyone, particularly in the context that I often work, which is in improvised music, the music comes from the people that you're working with, and so in this case, I don't think it's any different.
Yeah, I mean, it's so wonderful on the video. You know, you really see how the quartet is a kind of organism, and this push and pull and attunement and breathing between the musicians.
Absolutely.
But one thing that struck me was that, you know, in your sort of electronic music practice, and as an improviser, it seems to be quite a different sonic world. In the string quartet, it's somehow cleaner. Maybe there's less of this sort of layered distortion and glitch. How do you see that relationship between, you know, this one set of practices and what you've done here?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that myself a lot, actually. I think being a work that is like my first fully acoustic work, and also the first work for the string quartet, often when I come into a new area, or I'm learning a new skill, I'm kind of immersing myself in a new I guess language. I like to kind of start in a way from first principles. I want to be able to play with the instrumental resources from the ground up, and so there are certain things, certain gestures, certain, you know, melodic contours, etc., that felt right for the string quartet. I also have a background as a saxophone player, as an interpreter and an improviser, and I played a lot of chamber music in my time, and so I think there's a lot of my background as a chamber musician that is embedded in there as well. I mean, I think there's certain timbral elements in the way that I've written for the strings that in future works I'll definitely dive in and I guess explore more. But I think in this work I was more interested in the interaction between the parts and developing these structures that were 4 independent lines that could create something complex, rather than necessarily focusing so much on, I guess, extending what the instruments could do sonically.
Yeah. But you know, when you were like exchanging ideas with the group and you know, the rehearsal and the recording process, were there any sort of unexpected aspects or like aha moments, you know, in that process?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think they were. The initial contact I had with the quartet still had this original idea of sending software and kind of collaborating in that way, which was I was calling kind of a mediated, computer mediated collaboration. But what I think surprised me in this process was actually how, for me at least, it felt how kind of traditional it felt in my role, which was sitting and kind of ruminating on the musical material as notation and as score first. And so then a lot of the communication that I had with the musicians was fantastic for me, kind of learning this way of working, because this back and forth that was very much about the scored material, and very much about how this scored material was kind of developing, and how it could be, for instance, textures could come out better, or certain pacing could come out better. So I don't think there were too many surprises, but I think the process itself surprised me in terms of what I ended up spending most of my time thinking about and focusing on.
Okay. Yeah.
particularly in the early stages, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a sort of symbiotic relationship between you and like notations and, you know, what
Yeah.
sort of real
I have
feedback.
been.
Yeah.
You're right. You're right. I've been thinking that actually, and I think that, I mean, that's why every few weeks as I was writing this piece, I would come back to the title, and think, is this relevant now? You know, often, you know, there's times with the modular synthesis work that I do that I don't think about titles at all. I'm completely 100% in the weeds, right? Like in the detail, and then I'll have a piece by the end of my my work, and then I'll think of a title. Whereas with this piece, the title was there quite early on, and then sat in the background when I pivoted. But as I kept coming back to the title, I did think that the relationship between me and the material very much was a symbiotic relationship, that I was feeding off from, you know, each moment in the work is very dependent on what happened quite immediately prior. And so I see it almost like I mean, it took a while to write, but I see it almost like kind of a frozen improvisational process. And the way that I interact with the machines that I play with, the modular synthesizer, and also in other kind of, you know, software-based work, there is that push and pull between the now, what you're hearing right now, and what you respond to, and the decisions that you make next. And I can absolutely see that in the way that the score developed and the way the musical ideas developed over time. So it's kind of like a frozen improvisation, I would say. Yeah.
In a way, the notation is the software, isn't it? You know, but perhaps you have a different.
Yeah.
That's interesting when you describe it as this sort of frozen improvisation, because I think the relationship to time is quite different when you're working in that way. And how did that, you know, the agencies of that, you know, how's that expressed in the form? Is that something that you're able to reflect on?
It is. It is, absolutely. So that so as you know, as I'm working in a real-time way with machines, and that includes working with software and developing, you know, kind of generative software that then a performer will play with. I'm thinking about, I'm kind of building up sonic structures from these very low-level components, and I'm spending a lot of time in the process of designing the system or the work, actually listening back to what's happening. And so the development of the form in the work did actually have that kind of approach, because it is a natural approach for me to hear back what I'm performing and working with. So the score and the you know, notation software that I'm working with, a lot of people really don't like to hear the playback, for instance, of the software, because it gives you a very, very low fidelity version of what it will be, and there's no life in it, and rubato, etc. But there are times that I needed that for this kind of feedback loop to happen. And in terms of the way that time is developed, having the score in front of me and thinking about small snippets of time, for instance, there's, you know, elements in the early part of the score. There might be 1 or 2 bar gestures that emerged from, you know, designing the kind of, you know, temporal structure at that time, that then were stretched out later on in the piece. So trying to kind of find moments of material that I can stitch and weave together later on. So always, I seem to, and it seems to be in the work that I do in the interactive sphere as well. I'm very interested in kind of mining histories of material, and so I do that in my project Derivations, which quite literally records what a musician's doing and then extrapolates from that, so that the entire performance is using their history. And I found myself doing that with this piece. So there are moments that are stretched out, compressed, modulated versions of what had previously been, and so that's kind of this gradual expansion, and some of the sections do get longer as well as a result of that kind of process.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that
Mhm.
really struck me listening to the piece is I feel that there's a real change in relation to the kind of time that the music inhabits. So at the beginning, it's very the gestures seem to me, these kind of curling, sort of scalic gestures with punctuations seem to really belong to a vocabulary of string playing.
Yeah.
There's sort of historical lineages there, but somehow by the end, where everything sort of dissolves into these tiny little sounds, these little plucked, kind of little droplets of sounds. I thought there was a different kind of temporality that was emerging there. That was, for me, was more akin. It sort of dropped away from the sort of human gestures, something more akin to natural events, like the creaking of
Yeah,
things in the
interesting.
heat, or like these more unpredictable drops of water after a storm. I mean, these are just sort of making up some
Yeah,
images.
absolutely.
That somehow is this more unpredictable and perhaps gesturing towards a non-human temporalities. Is any of
Mm.
that resonant
Mm.
for you?
It's yeah, it absolutely does, and I think the fact that you're noticing a difference between, I guess, some of the early part of the work and the later part of the work in terms of the temporality and the material, just really shows that the process itself did change. The process itself kind of dictated the form and the material. And I think that was an interesting thing to look back on. I think a lot of these early gestures in the work, there's this kind of dynamism, this energy throwing a particular melodic line from one instrument to another, etc. And then ruptures where you kind of stop and there's a long sustained chord. Often I'm kind of working with these particular spaces and then pausing to move to something else. And often there might be a thread from that original material that is something that's worth continuing or turning on its head, and then others are discarded. And so because of this kind of local sense of development, often the sections can be quite different to each other with some commonalities. And so by the end, with these kind of very, as you mentioned, I love that, the analogy to kind of creaking or water droplets. There's just so much space between these gestures, because there were moments of that were creeping inside the dense textures, but I needed to allow that space to kind of punctuate that space with these particular sounds which had maybe been buried amongst the rest of the work earlier.
Yeah, these are really rich ideas and kind of metaphorical ways also of talking about form. So congratulations, Ben. It's so exciting. Really exciting to hear this work and contribute to each other's support. And the video will be alongside this interview. And I hope you'll be writing many more such pieces involving instruments. So
Certainly will.
fantastic.
Thanks, Liza.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.